You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 25th of March, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
The White House attempts to style out the bullet wound in its foot. Russia appears to agree a ceasefire in the Black Sea, but has it? And the latest jurisdiction to declare itself weary of the hijinks of boisterous tourists. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Burcu, Ozcelik and Oscar Guardiola-Riviera will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll meet the author of a book suggesting that Norway might be too lucky and too wealthy for its own good. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Burcu Ozcelik, Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security at the Royal United Services Institute, and by Oscar Guardiola-Riviera, Professor in International Law and International Affairs at Birkbeck College. Hello to you both.
Hello. Thank you so much.
Wonderful to be here, as always, Andrew.
Well, I should think so as well, Oscar. Oscar, as listeners to yesterday's show, and indeed last Friday's and Thursday's shows especially, will be aware, I was recently in Paris, but it turns out I was not alone. Well, actually, I knew I wasn't alone. There were loads of other people there as well, but you were among them.
I was in Paris.
What were you doing there?
I was in Pigalle, so I'm not going to tell you what I was doing there.
Was there any particular occasion, or did you just feel like going to Paris?
No, in fact, my wife and I took our daughter there because she was going to go in exchange, to stay with a French family. And we thought it might be a good idea if she sees the city before and she knows her whereabouts.
Well, it's my contention that it is almost never a bad idea to go to Paris. It's always a good time. You have not recently been to Paris, Burcu, but you have been somewhere rather more exotic, somewhere I haven't been but am curious about, which is Oman.
That's right. I had the great pleasure of being there in February. Oman is a fascinating, very distinct place amongst the Gulf, the Arab Gulf countries, very dedicated to their national heritage, very culturally aware of their history, the legacy of it. It's fascinating.
And yet they have managed to pull off being a Middle Eastern Gulf state, attracting almost no attention to themselves and generally staying out of trouble. Did you figure out what their secret is?
I was not able to do that, although I did try. Yes, they are very good at that. I think it takes practice.
Well, on the subject of people who are staying out of trouble, we will start with the United States. And when the principals of a given superpower are planning imminent military action, one thing they should probably take care not to do is accidentally copy in the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. This elementary precaution was not observed by people including the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Director of the CIA, and the Director of National Intelligence, among others, some of whom have since been explaining themselves not altogether convincingly to various congressional inquisitors.
Were you using your private phone or a public phone for the Signal discussions?
I won't speak to this because it's under review by the National Security Council. Once that review is complete, I'm sure we'll share the results with the committee.
Tulsi Gabbard there attempting to style this one out. Oscar, first of all, I don't think we can even rank this just on the scale of Trump administration screw-ups. On the scale of just screw-ups by governments of the United States or indeed governments anywhere, this is one for the ages, isn't it?
To quote one analyst, this goes as high as FUBAR, which is an acronym for, doing something reckless beyond recognition, plus an expletive that I cannot use on radio.
Yes, any listeners who have spent much time around soldiers, especially American soldiers, will be familiar with the acronym. It is extraordinary, though, Burcu. Is there any chance, though, do we think that nobody has broken the actual law?
I think it's difficult to defend that line, although I suspect, and already very early indications from President Trump, is that they will attempt to they will claim that no laws have been broken, that this was a glitch, that Mike Waltz made a mistake, and that he will learn from this lesson now. But it's very difficult to defend that, given that this is a serious violation, a breach of national security protocols. I mean, the very fact that this kind of sensitive intelligence sharing was transmitted on mobile devices using a civilian messaging app, I think is highly problematic. So it's not just that a journalist was added to the group inadvertently, but it's the very technology, the messaging app that was used in and of itself that's an issue.
I mean, and that line that Mike Waltz has made a mistake, Oscar, as if he merely hit reply all when he only meant to reply to the sender, which I suspect is something a great many of us have done to more or less embarrassment at some point in our lives, that surely is not going to hold. He is the National Security Advisor of the United States who copied in a journalist on discussions about imminent military action.
Andrew, these reads like a chapter of a slow horses, the BBC spy series, minus the good actors. But it does give us a sort of window into the minds and practices of the people involved. And that is very much the problem. Because what you see when you look at the way in which they were, the media they were using, the language they were using, the complete lack of care and caution for the law, that immediately gives you a window into the attitude that they seem to have vis-a-vis the law. We lawyers are fond of quoting a few maxims, and there is one by Lactantius that goes more or less like this: the law is like cobwebs; it is very good at catching flies, but very bad at catching mighty and powerful hornets. And that's very much what might happen here. The mighty and powerful do believe that the law is not for them, that the law is for the rabble, for the weaker. And that seems to be the attitude that is revealed once more to us through these leaks, these glitches, as Trump says now, these mistakes, which are far from being so. They are indeed violations of the Espionage Act, among other laws.
Well, among the people that the law is apparently for, Burcu, are, of course, Democrats. And can we imagine that were the shoe on the other foot here and that a bunch of Democratic Party senior officials in the White House had copied in somebody from Fox News on imminent military action, do we imagine the attitude of the Republican Party in that circumstance would be, well, come on, everybody makes mistakes, these things happen?
I don't think so. I think that's quite far-fetched, isn't it? I mean, the very go-to example, of course, is it was almost 10 years ago since we saw the Hillary Clinton email scandal. And the Republicans threw a very big fit over that. It was a long-standing issue.
They haven't stopped.
They haven't stopped. So, no, I don't think if the shoe was on the other foot that the Republicans would be as forgiving as they have been now. But I think what is particularly interesting, I don't think that the Democrats are going to let this one go as quickly. I think this is an issue of national security, and they will want to address this directly and clearly with a high level of accountability for as long as possible. The interesting what the public reaction will be, of course. I know President Trump has already said, don't worry about it. This was just a mistake. It won't happen again. But there was sensitive information that was leaked, and that this raises questions about, is this how the administration, the close circle operates? Is there other examples of such leaks? How vulnerable is the United States now, particularly at a time where cyber attacks, cyber warfare is on the rise? There are vulnerabilities from Iran, Russia, China using a civilian messaging app like this. What does this say about the way in which the U.S. administration operates?
But is it fair to say, Oscar, that if we lived in remotely normal times, and one might argue that if we did, then this wouldn't have happened in the first place, but in a for want of a less pejorative term, normal administration, a screw-up of this scale, we would be expecting / demanding sackings and resignations, wouldn't we, at the very least?
Oh, absolutely. Both Waltz and Hexed would have been obliged to resign already if we were in normal times. But that is precisely the point. We're not. And the definition of abnormality at this point is precisely this kind of attitude towards the law, a rather disrespectful attitude towards it. Yes, the law is for others, but not for us, because we are exceptional. We are the mighty. We are the super clever. Well, apparently they're not.
Just finally on this, Burcu, leaving aside the scandal itself, the ramifications of which may take some days or weeks to emerge, from what we have seen of the actual conversation among the rulers of the world making decisions about military action, did we learn anything especially interesting, shocking, surprising, or that we couldn't have guessed?
I think what we saw was a confirmation of what we suspect. And the first was a general lack of real understanding of the nuances of the issue of the Houthis and the Yemen strikes, what this would entail, the levels of efficacy with respect to the military strikes. And one of the participants in the group, in fact, says, well, the Americans, the U.S. public, don't know who the Houthis are. And I think that's true. As someone who follows the region, who works on the region, the number of times I've been asked to please explain who are the Houthis after such a long time of this. The Houthis and the struggle there predates, of course, the most recent 18 months. The second point, I think, is the content of the messages we're revealing about how the U.S. sees its relationship with European allies. The mention of European freeloaders being pathetic, right, and how Europe actually stands to gain more than the United States from opening up maritime shipping lanes in the Red Sea, and potentially that if the military strikes begin to get extremely expensive, then the U.S. should consider ways of extracting sort of a benefit from the Europeans, that they should somehow be expected to pay for having the shipping lanes reopened, which is in their interest. So this heavily transactional approach, and it was just there on display for all of us to see.
Worth remembering, of course, that European warships have been patrolling the Red Sea and coming under fire for some considerable while now in an effort to keep the canal and shipping routes open. Just finally on this from you, Oscar, what did you take away from what we learnt? Well, what did we glean from the chat itself?
Well, two things. The first one, just to insist the cavalier attitude of high-ranking members of the U.S. administration towards the law. But second, and you just mentioned these, Basu, the loathing of Europe. I do believe these must be shocking to many European leaders who have for so long taken for granted that the U.S. is the backstop, that there is such a thing as the special relationship, that indeed the West is always united. Well, now we are being called upon to reconsider what that means, what that alliance means, and whether or not Europe will have to begin to think about its own foreign policy rather than continue to cede its foreign policy to the United States, which has very different interests. One thing that must be said and discussed is the way in which this kind of transactional attitude might not necessarily be new. If you look at 1901 and the very origins of what we now might call, for lack of a better term, the U.S. empire, you might see precisely that attitude. Taking care of the seas was principle there, that there are lessons there for us to learn.
Well, to the Black Sea, where peace may have broken out. Within the last couple of hours, the United States has said that Russia and Ukraine have agreed a framework which will permit the safe passage of commercial vessels. It seems like a relatively cost-free concession from Russia, which has distinguished itself in the maritime realm of this conflict by losing the war at sea to a country which doesn't really have a navy. Nevertheless, Russia is still seeking an amount of sanctions relief before it agrees to implement even these measures. Burcu, with that qualifier in mind especially, is this really anything? Because it would not be the first time that we have seen Russia say, yes, we agree with this, but...
That's right. There's that but. I do not think this is a major breakthrough, and I suspect the United States will want to present it as one. The Trump administration seeks an easy win. They need something concrete, something tangible to show that direct talks with Russia in the pursuit of a lasting, sustainable ceasefire deal are working. And this news, of course, has received already wide coverage as sort of a potential turning point. It reintroduces Russia's access and in terms of its commodity trade, fertilizers and agricultural products across the Black Sea. In a way, it re-energizes the Black Sea grain deal, as it was known, that was brokered by the United Nations and Turkey in 2022. And then that was an important milestone because it broke that barrier, and it allowed Ukraine to be able to export and to revive its economy and to meet certain basic needs. Russia, of course, withdrew from that agreement a year later, claiming that its part of the deal was not being met. So now I think Russia has a lot to gain from this current agreement that was announced today. There have been already minor, maybe subtle divergences in how the Ukrainian and the Russian sides declared in their own press briefings what the agreement entails. Ukraine has been insisting that the agreement also deals with energy infrastructure and prohibits attacks on energy infrastructure. And Russia, of course, is focusing on how it benefits from the agreement because it can sell its commodities. Important, of course, is that the deal does not allow Russian military vessels, naval vessels, to cross the Black Sea. And Ukraine had made very impressive gains there, of course, in pushing back the Russian fleet, with important implications for Turkey as well. And of course, Turkey and Russia are the two dominant powers in the Black Sea historically and to this day. Turkey has been frustrated about being put in the cold and with direct talks between U.S., Russia, and Ukraine on the ceasefire deal. And there are some concerns in Ankara as to what this will mean for the superiority that they had gained in the Black Sea.
Hey, Oscar, would it be, and this is possibly the charitable interpretation, would it be incredibly gullible of the United States to offer Russia sanctions relief on the basis of this agreement? Because, among other things, Russia is talking about wanting to be reincorporated into SWIFT, the sort of international banking framework.
Well, that is perhaps one of the most extraordinary things one can read in the press releases concerning the agreement. Does this seem that the sanctions that have been in place are on course to be lifted? Well, it seems to be the case, which, of course, paves the way for the argument of many critics of this deal, which I struggle to call a peace deal. In the sense that what we are seeing here is one party to the war, sort of gaining all the concessions, being allowed to concentrate on its land, the land strategy of its war effort, while the negotiator, inverted commas, seems to be aligned with those demands. So it's very difficult to see that as a negotiated deal. It's very difficult to see how it paves the way towards a durable, a long-lasting peace, and it does look rather one-sided. So you're absolutely correct in pointing out that the lifting of sanctions seems to be already, about to happen.
Burcu, just finally on this one, does it strike you that there's actually anything much in this for Ukraine?
No. I wonder if it's a way for President Zelensky to get back in the good books after that terrible debacle in the Oval Office by agreeing to this. I think for Russia, it's a huge advantage. It also could mean that they're buying time. They're dragging theirs out for as long as possible. President Trump has, of course, said that only he understands the mind of Vladimir Putin, and that if anyone's going to strike a deal, it's him. And that's yet to be seen.
That was supposed to happen on day one.
Within 24 hours, as I recall, was the original timescale we were given. I suspect, however, we will yet have further opportunity to return to it. And so to Venezuela, a country which has long loomed large in US President Donald Trump's vast menagerie of bêtes noires ever since the election of 2020, after which some of Trump's more excitable surrogates, Rudolph Giuliani for one, claimed that Trump's loss had been engineered by accomplices of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and/or his predecessor Hugo Chavez. While Trump has not threatened to invade Venezuela or anything, as of this broadcast, etc., he is now threatening to stick a 25% tariffs on imports from all countries which buy Venezuela's oil. Fun fact, after China, the second biggest purchaser of Venezuelan oil is the United States. Oscar, is it clear what this is actually supposed to accomplish?
It's complicated, but there are two elements to this story. It's complicated because it's contradictory. There are two elements to this story. On the one hand, there is the sanctions or the promise of raising sanctions, tariffs, while at the same time you have the Trump administration allowing Chevron to continue to exploit oil in Venezuela and sell it. So you might say that if anyone is winning here, is Chevron. That seems to fit the kind of transactional mindset that is attributed to President Trump. At the same time, this allows Trump to continue to roll his story about Venezuelan immigrants joining criminal gangs or coming from criminal gangs into the country. An argument that has been consistently questioned by U.S. judges in courts of appeal, who have rightly actually made an analogy between the use of the Alien Act, which is the piece of legislation that the
Alien Enemies Act,
Alien Enemies Act,
1798,
the piece of legislation used by the Trump administration, quite extraordinarily. In fact, it was used, or it would have been used to deal with Nazi spies. And so the judge made an analogy between the fact that the U.S. administration treated Nazis better than it treated the Venezuelans who are being deported. That analogy has been called disgusting by members of the U.S. administration, but in fact is the correct analogy, because the judge needs to establish a precedent. And that would be the precedent. But the question, the context of that precedent was precisely that there was a war between the U.S. and Germany, which is not the case with Venezuela. If anything, Trump has been very ambivalent towards the Maduro regime. Now they claim that this is a kind of, modern-day warfare. Well, that kind of argument doesn't hold in court.
I mean, it is, of course, far from clear, Burcu, that of the people who have been so picturesquely deported, that all of them are Venezuelans, and certainly not all of them have been sent to Venezuela. Many of them have been sent with a noteworthy lack of due process to El Salvador. And some of them appear to be neither, in fact, Salvadorian nor Venezuelan, just people who have tattoos that one or other immigration agent thought meant something it may or may not do. But to ask you a variation on what I asked Oscar, is it clear to you that there is any kind of strategy here? Is Trump trying to go somewhere with turning Venezuela into the demon of the week?
If there is a grand strategy, and I ask this a lot when it comes to the Middle East, and there could be a link there in terms of targeting Venezuela, but actually targeting China. And I made this argument with respect to the commencement of this renewed round of aerial and naval strikes against the Houthis in Yemen, to return to that subject. And what part of, at the geopolitical level, what's the plan there, the target there, the grand strategy, if we can speak of one, is to disrupt the Iran-China oil trade, the sanction-busting oil trade. Of course, China is a large purchaser of Venezuelan oil. So if there is a grand strategy, and I might be sort of stretching here, or perhaps giving the Trump administration more credit than they deserve, but I think it's disrupting sanctioned oil trade that benefits American adversaries is in the backdrop of this. What could be going on? Since the announcement of the tariff, which I believe would start on the 2nd of April against Venezuela, there's already been confusion and some scrambling for explanation across Chinese traders. And just bear in mind that not long ago, I think last week, OFAC announced sanctions against a Chinese teapot refinery, which is a private refinery, not state-owned, for facilitating the purchase of sanctioned Iranian oil up to $500 million. And this was significant, and this is part of Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran. So disrupting this trade relationship that benefits Iran and allows it to finance terrorism in the Middle East and globally. But that could be part of the strategy, if there is one, when it comes to Venezuela as well. It's targeting China, which is seen, of course, as America's greatest sort of adversary of the 21st century.
Well, to Bali now, which has become the latest of a growing number of holiday spots to get specific, indeed almost menacing, about the degree to which it expects tourists to behave themselves. Though it is, of course, hard to imagine what grounds Bali has for complaint, given that so many of its visitors are Australians, renowned in Bali as elsewhere for both their propriety and their sobriety, and for really very rarely steering mopeds into ponds on our way home from the tequila slamming contest. Bali's Governor, Wayan Costa, is promising the ton of bricks treatment to tourists who meet his definition of, quote, naughty. Oscar, is this fair enough?
Well, according to your description of Australian tourists, it is.
We're never any trouble, Oscar. We are immaculately polite and well-dressed. We're famous for that.
But the problem with those kinds of measures is that, of course, they always rebound because, the local trade is dependent on basically that kind of behavior. So what are you going to do? Having said that, of course, we would all prefer tourists to behave according to local customs and so on. But I've yet to see a place where those actually occur, including very strict ones. I mean, the Emirates and so on. You know what to do if you want to circumvent those constraints.
Is it possible, Burcu, that he is calculating that he might attract a better class and a wealthier class of customer if he does crack down on yobbish backpackers?
Possibly. That could be part of the rationale, the economic component of attracting higher-paying quality tourists that would go to some of the five-star resorts rather than the beach hostels in the busier towns on the coast. I think the governor, he ran on sort of a pro-people campaign, and he pledged to bring greater attention to local customs and sort of celebrate Balinese culture and local tradition. So he's delivering, I think, on that pledge, as well as sort of sustainability and ecotourism. But yeah, I think fair enough. Having been to Bali and having seen the crowds,
did you at any point steer a moped into a pond, or not so much?
Not so much. Maybe I missed a trick there, but no, I did not. I think I was one of the good ones.
Because I do.
Are you going to return?
I hope to, yes.
Because I do wonder about this, Oscar, having travelled a lot and occasionally travelled in places where there are lots of tourists, and it is the case that a certain quantity of people just seem to forget how to behave in public once they are somewhere where they don't live.
You know, my wife is from the Canary Islands, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But it seems to me the Canarians have come up with a good solution. They tend to sort of isolate the tourist in certain areas of
a bit like London does with Leicester Square and Covent Garden.
So, and if you live there, if you're a local, you know you're not going to go there. And that takes care of the problem. Burcu is really generous when she reads the minds of these fellows, and fair enough. But those kinds of measures rarely work. What tends to work is precisely this specialization of tourism. They can go there, but not here. Some other cities just suffer immensely. I mean, Barcelona is just impossible. It becomes impossible. And actually, you mentioned central London. Well, we know exactly what happens, particularly in Christmas or in the summer. So we don't go there. We don't go to Leicester Square.
Well, finally then to both of you, and cards on the table here, is there anywhere, because I would have said ironically in response to the upcoming question, both Bali and the Canary Islands, anywhere that you have kind of fancied going but haven't because you suspect it will be overrun with riffraff?
Oh gosh. Going back to New York.
Times Square is a challenge. I'm going there very soon. But I would say also Los Cabos in Mexico. I mean, I remember when I was young and I heard that Sammy Hagar was opening a bar in Los Cabos. I want to go there, but then after having had the experience, no way.
A bar run by Sammy Hagar out of Van Halen in Los Cabos. There's not going to be a huge chance of confusing that with the round table at the Algonquin, is there?
Not at all.
No. Oscar Guardiola-Riviera and Burcu Ozcelik, thank you both for joining us. Now, finally on today's show, if anybody kept a global index of the most annoyingly fortunate countries, Norway would be a contender for top spot. Thanks to ample oil and gas reserves discovered in the 1960s, Norway leapfrogged, whichever of those is correct, from being a relatively modest economy to one of the richest in the world, endowing its government with a €1.7 trillion sovereign wealth fund, the biggest of its kind. All is not quite as splendid as it sounds, however. The past decade has seen the Norwegian economy stagnate, and the population is starting to feel it. Economist and former head of McKinsey in Norway, Martin Beck-Holter, has controversially argued that it is precisely Norway's famed oil fund that is to blame for these problems. In what has become the country's most hotly debated book of this year, The Country That Became Too Rich. Monocle's resident Norwegian Gunnar Grønlid spoke with Holte earlier and began by asking what exactly is going on with Norway's economy.
Norway is the most opportunity-rich country in the Western world, really, right? The previous generation has managed the petroleum wealth extraordinarily well. So it's like the country has been given a huge inheritance. So now it's the petroleum fund is $2,000 billion and divided by 5 million people. It's a big inheritance, right? But as with heritage generally and inheritance, it's a problem, right? It requires discipline to utilize inheritance in a good way. And the way we have managed it, the last decade has made the economy weaker. The inheritance and the petroleum money has been spent to make the society more passive, less active. It has all been spent on increasing public spending and in the process reducing the incentives in the economy, quite more broadly. And the outcome of that is that income for regular people has stagnated. So we've had a lost decade in terms of real wages, and by Norwegian standards, it's the worst decade in 60 years, or at least 55 years.
And that's very interesting because it's the story that we Norwegians tell ourselves, the way that, let's say, I was sort of brought up in school. The story that we're told about Norway is that it was basically a very poor country, and then we discovered oil, and then a very wise sort of state management of the money that came from that led to this incredible wealth. What do you think is actually wrong about that story?
This is also the story that we tell, at home, right? So in TV on TV shows, TV series, on radio programs. This is the story that all Norwegians hear about, right? But if you just think about the hard facts, 90% of our net present income is from hard work on the mainland economy. 10% is basically the petroleum fund, right? And 90% of what we talk about is petroleum, and 10% is the mainland. and this book is about trying to help regular Norwegians appreciate that fact. And the reason why we became wealthy was that we managed the mainland economy extremely well, in addition to managing the petroleum fund.
You sort of identify this one very fundamental flaw, as you see it, in the petroleum fund, which you say was managed incredibly well, but that there was one flaw in how all of that was set up. Can you explain that?
With the petroleum wealth, there are kind of 4 layers in terms of managing it. Layer 1 is actually managing to set up a fund for the politicians to accept that they're not free to spend the money on a running basis. So that's layer 1, which they managed to do. Layer 2 is that it has been managed by the central bank, by a special unit set up by the central bank in an extremely cost-effective manner, with very little controversy, which is kind of layer 2. Layer 3 is that we have a rule for how much of the fund we're allowed to spend each year. So now, we are allowed to spend 3% of the fund every year. But layer 4 is, how should we spend it? And there are guidelines for how to do that, but no rules. And that means that the petroleum fund, it's now 20% of government budget. It has increased from basically 0 to 20% of the government budget over, say, a 15-year period. And that means that, the petroleum fund, the money we're allowed to spend is basically becomes part of the short-term politics. So instead of the guideline was that the money should be spent to invest in a strong mainland economy with good incentives to work, save, and invest. And it's used basically to increase subsidies to businesses, to increase transfers to all types of organizations that represent important voting groups, on extravagant public projects that are extremely expensive because there are no budget constraints. And that is what I call about passivating instead of activating the population.
On a sort of positive note, funny enough, almost immediately after you published this book, in the book, like I mentioned earlier, you praise Jens Stoltenberg as having been one of these sort of day one leaders, as you call them, who make difficult choices that lead to growth and innovation and so forth. And now we've had this sort of lost decade of day two leaders. And then in a surprise move, Jens Stoltenberg returns as finance minister. Do you see this as a positive opportunity where these trends might actually shift and turn around?
Economic policy is a kind of outcome of the game between voters and politicians, right? And politicians, they offer policies that they believe will win them elections. So I've spoken to quite a few politicians. They are aware of all the challenges I talk about, but they find it very hard to fix it when they're going to propose economic policy for voters, because voters reward short-term policy. And then Jens Stoltenberg is back, which is it's probably the biggest opportunity to change this near term, because his understanding of economic policy is extraordinary. His standing in the Norwegian population is extraordinary. So if there's anyone who can, change the outcome of that play between politicians and voters, it will be him, right? But my project is also to, help voters be more aware of what will serve them long term, because this is, not easy, right? It's a hard topic, but there's huge interest in the Norwegian population to get a grip on this, right? Because they can feel it in their, day-to-day life.
That was the economist Martin Beck-Holter speaking with Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid. Martin's book, The Country That Became Too Rich, is currently only available to Norwegian readers, but there is an English translation on the horizon. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Burcu, Ozcelik and Oscar Guardiola-Riviera. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Francesca Jokes. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.